Senator Cruz, you have a further amendment?
I do. The third and final amendment I'd like to call up is Cruz Substitute Amendment Number 1 to S-127. The hearing we held last month on this issue was helpful. There are real concerns surrounding the business practices of PBMs that warrant further investigation. And right now, the FTC is conducting a serious economic study of PBMs. It's ongoing. One concern that I have with this bill is that it effectively puts the cart before the horse, that it prejudges the results of the FTC study and it assumes the solution before knowing the precise nature of the problem. I think we need to be careful about advancing legislation dramatically expanding the FTC's power and to do so before the agency has even completed the PBM study. My substitute amendment would require the FTC to complete its ongoing study within 18 months. It also broadens the focus of the study to ensure that we get the full economic picture of the supply chain, including consideration of how big pharma companies operate in the supply chain, which is lacking in this legislation. This legislation addresses one piece of the supply chain but doesn't address big pharma. My amendment requires the FTC to focus on a number of key economic questions, including consolidation and competition in the entire prescription drug supply chain, how drug list prices are set by big pharma companies, how PBMs design formularies and rebates, how PBMs affect the adoption of generic and specialty drugs, whether all actors in the prescription drug supply chain are transparent and disclose their information, including the benefits and cost of disclosure, and the PBM's use of clawbacks and direct or indirect remuneration. My amendment directs the FTC to focus on the consumer. We've tended to look at the impacts of PBMs on payments to doctors and to pharmacists, but the person we should ultimately be trying to help is the patient. We want that person to have access to affordable medicines. All of us should want to know these practices by PBMs, but also by big pharma companies and other actors, and how they affect the cost of prescription drugs for the average Americans, as well as their health plan premiums. This committee and Congress would benefit by having data about consumer prices, and I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment and make sure the FTC completes its study before advancing legislation that gives the agency additional power before it has assessed the problem that it's trying to fix.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Today, average Americans spend over $1,126 per year on prescription drugs, compared to $552 for people in other high-income countries. That's more than double the cost. We know that PBMs can play a positive role, but they are a black box when it comes to the prescription drug market, and manipulation can occur. In fact, 3 PBMs control, as you mentioned earlier, 80% of the market. And because of their market power and lack of transparency and even minimal accountability, they have been getting away with harmful practices that we are now calling out. Senator Grassley and I have looked at this issue for a long time and worked to call for more information, but we also know and are clearly on board with outlining what are manipulative practices so that we can hold them accountable. It is time to give this to the FTC and not just to have a study. I don't know if anybody else has any further comments. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Schatz? Mr. Markey? Mr. Peters? Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Duckworth? Mr. Tester? Ms. Sinema? Ms. Rosen? Mr. Lujan? Mr. Hickenlooper? Mr. Warnock? Mr. Welch? Mr. Cruz? Mr. Thune? Mr. Wicker? Mrs. Fisher? Mr. Moran? Mr. Sullivan? Mrs. Blackburn? Mr. Young? Mr. Budd? Mr. Schmidt? Mr. Vance? Mrs. Capito? Ms. Lummis? Ms. Cantwell?
No.
The noes are 18, the yeses are 9.
The amendment is not agreed to.